Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're doing okay on this difficult day of Yom Hashoah. If you were in David Bernstein's lecture, I hope that you found it meaningful and that it added some color to this day of tremendous tragedy. I wanted to share a Rashi, or really a number of psukim, and take a look at something today in our Rashi share that really does speak to the nature of this day of Yom HaShoah. I'll begin with a Rashi on this week's Parsha, which I actually shared very briefly this morning in Shul, but which I want to elaborate upon this afternoon, which I think is very relevant to the themes of the day. So if you take a look here, I'm sharing my screen right now. Um, the pasuk describes the Metzora, the whole process of becoming a Metzora, as we've been talking about over the last number of days, but then famously describes the state of the Metzora and where he has to go during his period of Tumah. So firstly, the Torah describes that Tzarua Sherbo Anega Begadav Yufrumim, Rosho Yefarua, his clothes are torn, his hair is unkempt, Al Safam Yateh, his clothing is up by his mouth and down by his head. All the different signs of Avelus. The Gemara in Moed Katan goes through many of the different similarities, contrasts, and some of the similarities and differences, the comparisons and the contrasts between the Metzora and the Avel. There's many, many similarities, many parallels between them. The Metzora is in a state of Avelus, a state of mourning, a state of loss, really the loss of self in this way. All these three signs, the torn clothing, like we have torn clothing, the unkemptness, and the covering of the mouth are all different signs of Avelus, which are parallel here to the Metzora. And finally, v'tameh tameh ikra is to call out to anyone who comes near him that he's tameh. And finally, kol yomei asher hanegabo yitma tamehu badad yeshev michutz lamachane moshavo. All the days that he is tameh, he has to sit badad yeshev, alone, isolated, michutz lamachane. Rashi points out chutz l'shalosh machanos, outside the machane Shechina, the machane Levia, and the machane of Am Yisrael, totally outside the camp, totally separated, totally isolated. Rashi points out badad yeshev, shelo yu tameim yoshim imo. Even the other tameim cannot sit with him. He has to be totally isolated. Al pidrosh, Rashi quotes from the rabbis, "Man nishtana mishar tmeim leishiv badad." Why is the isolation so extreme? In this case of the Metzora, kuhiv dil b'lashon hara ben ish leishto ben ish lerehu afhu yibadel. If we believe that the Metzora is being punished for lashon hara is something that splits between people, isolates people, breaks the bond between people, and now midah keneged midah, this person has to be punished with isolation as well. That's the localized interpretation here in the context of the Metzora. But as I mentioned this morning, it evoked such powerful imagery. The aloneness, the badad symbolism is so poignant on Yom HaShoah. When we think of the Jewish people and all that we endured throughout history, and especially during the Holocaust, there is no better word than to say badad. We were absolutely alone. No one came to help us. No one came to save us. No one came to stand up for us. That's the history of anti-Semitism in the world, and certainly our experience during the Holocaust. Yes, they were isolated, righteous Gentiles, isolated nations, isolated individuals who stood up for us and helped, but overall, we were very much alone. And that aloneness was so painful, not only in the physical sense, causing us to be annihilated so severely in numbers, over 6 million, but also in an emotional sense, not to have those allies that we so desperately need. That theme of badad, of aloneness, is very pervasive on Yom HaShoah. And unfortunately, it haunts us till today because no matter what, we still feel alone in the world, even with the state of Israel, with allies, with friends, with protective countries such as the United States. We still face that feeling of being different, of being alone, and of being isolated, which is captured through the word badad. Badad yeshev, it's so extreme. It's more extreme than levad, even though the words are related. Levad means alone, and that's a certain level of distress, but badad is an even more extreme form of that. And we know that the painful description of badad is not only by the Metzora, but by us as a nation. If you like, take, for example, the most famous example, perhaps at the beginning of Megillas Eicha, another moment, not Yom HaShoah, but the day of the Churban, Tisha B'Av. Yirmiyahu describes the nature of the Churban as Eicha Yashva Badad Ha'ira Basi'am. Eicha, the beginning of his keynotes, the beginning of his of deep, painful crying over the Churban begins with the prime description as Badad. The worst part of this, says Yirmiyahu, is Yerushalayim was Badad. not just livad, but badad, totally isolated. V'ir rabasiam, haitaka amana. The city that was filled with life and with people and with commerce and with politics and with international relations is alone, almana, totally widowed, totally devoid of her children, totally devoid of the footsteps of traffic, of people, of coming. This badad is galmud miyoshvea, totally removed from all of its inhabitants. It's alone, totally isolated. That's the painful badad of the Metzora as an individual, now extrapolated here by Yirmiyahu to us as a nation, which we so poignantly feel on this day of Yom HaShoah. And it's not just in Eicha, but it's in Yeshayahu, Yirmiyahu, multiple places. For example, here the pasuk in Yeshayahu says, "Ki ir b'tzura badad, naveh mishulach v'ne'ezav kamidbar." The city was b'tzura, it was besieged, badad, totally isolated, totally alone, totally cut off. It was mushulach, it was ne'ezav, it was thrown away, it was abandoned kamidbar, like a desert. There is no more life in the city. Animals will graze there. Description of Yirmiyahu again, of the Jewish people complaining to God, Lo yashavti besod, or the city of Yerushalayim complaining to God, Lo yashavti besod misachakim ve'elos, mipnei yadcha badad yashavti. I'm no longer sitting with those who laugh and those who rejoice and those who play and those who are having a beautiful, easy life. I'm no longer joyous because of your hand, God, that destroyed me. I am badad yashavti. I'm sitting badad. Ki zam miletani. You filled me with zam, hatred. God, your wrath was poured out against us, and now we are badad. All of these psukim indicate the badad of the Metzora on a national level is felt by the Jewish people in times of destruction and times of disaster. But I don't want to end on a totally down note. I want to point out something very interesting, which I don't think people fully grasp. They think badad, they immediately think echa yashva badad. They think of the Metzora, badad yeshev michutz lamachana. But interestingly, in the Torah, not necessarily in Tanakh, but in the Torah, badad also has a positive connotation when describing the Jewish people. For example, starting in Parshas Balak, when Bilam is trying to curse the Jewish people, he ends up blessing the Jewish people. And one of the blessings is Kimerosh Tzurim Erena, Umigvaos Ashurenu, Hein Am Levadad Yishkon Uvagoim Lo Yischashav. He says that the Jewish people will be Am Levadad Yishkon. It will be a nation that will dwell badad, alone. And on the surface, that does sound like a curse, but you have to understand it in context. Although it is talking about the DNA of the Jewish people, and that's what HaKadosh Baruch Hu is implanting in the mouth of Bilam, that part of our DNA is badad. But the badad being described here by Bilam, which sometimes comes to negatively affect us, like in the case of Echa Yeshva Badad, I think here has a tinge of bracha. It's in the context of bracha here. He's trying to curse us, but it's really a bracha that God is giving the Jewish people. Hein am levadad yishkon has a connotation that part of our DNA is badad, and that's a bad thing, but it also has a good side. As Rashi points out here, hein an hu asher zachu lo avosav lishkon badad. It's a schus. It's a merit that we dwelled alone. We have an isolated, unique status amongst all the nations. Uvagoyim lo yischashav. We won't be numbered amongst the rest of the nations of the world. What does Rashi mean here? Lo yu ne'asim kala na'asim kala imshar ha'umos. The rest of the nations of the world will cease to exist, but we will not be numbered with them. We will not cease to exist. We are alone. We are badad. We have our own unique status because we will survive through eternity. That's a bracha. The badad, being alone, is sometimes painful when we're isolated from the rest of the nations of the world. But there's also a bracha latent in it that one day that will come to serve us well because we are not like the nations of the world. Unfortunately, they scorn us for it, but we have to understand in our own identity, unrelated to how they relate to us, we have to understand that we are different. We are a people of eternity. We are a people of bracha. You look further, Parshas Ha'azinu, Hashem badad yanchenu ve'ein imo el nechar, part of the bracha of the Shiras Ha'azinu, looking back on the experience of the Jewish people in the Midbar is again, God left us badad. What does that mean? Betach mihagam bamidbar. We are alone. We had unique status. Most nations die out in the desert. Most nations suffer in the desert. We were badad. We were different. We were alone. We were isolated. God protected us in a bubble. He gave us bracha as part of the badad. And finally, towards the very end of the Torah, in Bezos HaBracha, after Ma'ona Elokei Kedem, this is what we read on Sukkos Torah, the very end of the Torah, all the brachos to the tribes. After that, the Aliyah of Chasan Torah says, Vayishkon Yisrael betach badad. Ein Yaakov el Eretz Dagan v'tirosh av shamav yarkutal. Incredible bracha, physical sustenance for the Jewish people, and we will be shochein betach badad. We will dwell alone in security. What does that mean? Kol yachid v'yachid ish tachas gafno mefuzarim ve'ein tzrichim lisasef uleishiv yachad mipnei ha'ayev. We will be so secure as a nation that every individual, not only are we different and unique and isolated as a nation, but each individual could be badad, could literally dwell alone under his or her fig tree and vine and dwell with beautiful physical produce and sustenance and wealth and security alone, unafraid. We don't even have to gather together in cities of secure, walled cities with protection and army. We can dwell alone, each person under their vine and under their fig tree, and be totally secure. That's the level of protection and bracha we get from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So all these cases of badad are cases of bracha. It's a double-edged sword. The badad sometimes leaves us alone and isolated and rejected and scorned, like in the case of Eicha, and Yirmiyahu, and Yeshayahu, and Churban, and today of Yom Hashoah. But we hope for a time when the badad will be a source of bracha as well, when our unique alone status will afford us closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and not distance, where our unique and alone status of badad will afford us protection and not the scorn of the nations, where our alone and unique status will afford us bracha, as described here in the end of the Torah. We can continue to be successful as individuals, and as a nation. That's what we pray for as we emerge from today, Yom HaShoah, remembering all of the sadness, all of the tragedy, all of the loss, and hoping and praying that one day HaKadosh Baruch Hu will grant us the bracha of Badad, where we will no longer have to suffer these kinds of tragedies again. Thank you, and hope you have a wonderful day.